Welcome to the Content Strategy Interviews podcast. Each week, we talk with accomplished content strategy experts to share their wisdom with our friends in the content community. And now here's your host, Larry Swanson.
Welcome, everyone, to the second episode of the Content Strategy Interviews podcast. I'm delighted to welcome to the show today Paula Land. She's a genuine pioneer in the field of content strategy. She started, like so many of us, in old-fashioned publishing, and then went on to the tech world, and then onto an agency. So she has a really interesting background, and I'd like to introduce Paula now and let her talk a little bit more about that, her background.
Hi, everyone. As Larry said, I actually started my journey to content strategy via publishing. So I started out in good old-fashioned book publishing in New York. I worked for a couple of sort of scholarly and reference publishers. When I moved to Seattle, I actually worked for a couple of the small presses here, while there were still small presses surviving against the big presses. And then, like a lot of people here in the Seattle area, I ended up spending some time at Microsoft. So I worked for about 10 years at Microsoft in a group called the Microsoft Developer Network. Somewhat unusually for Microsoft, I worked in the same group the entire time I was there. I didn't bounce around, but I really happened to love that particular audience and what we were doing for them. So that was a good spot for me. I left Microsoft actually to go to an agency. So I went to the digital agency Razorfish, which now called, or at the time was called Avenue A Razorfish. Now it's been merged with or bought by Sapient, so it's called Sapient Razorfish. But I was there for about 4 years doing content strategy work for clients. And then after 4 years there, I left and started my own consultancy. So for the last 7 years, I've been working as a consultant with my company, Strategic Content.
Well, I want to talk more about your current consultancy and like kind of how you operate there, but I'm really curious about that transition because I made a similar transition in the mid-90s from old school book publishing to the online world, and they're a tiny bit different. Can you tell me about how that transition went for you and the challenges and kind of how you dealt with that?
Yeah, a tiny bit different is understating it. So going from small press or scholarly publishing to a gigantic digital corporation was a pretty big leap. One of the biggest issues or biggest changes was the pace of things. So, when you're working on a book, even back then, I'm sure it's probably accelerated a bit now, but back then you could work on a book for a year or more. It was kind of the typical expectation was that it was about 9 months from start to finish, and people would make sort of making a book like making a baby. So going from those sort of schedules to a digital publishing environment where you could publish daily, the pace was just obviously very different. In some ways, though, the content wasn't. Because I had done editorial work and acquisition work in my publishing career, going to work within a giant content group at Microsoft that also kind of shared with my publishing experience the focus on a very specific audience. So this was going from scholars or practitioners in my publishing career to developers who really are kind of the equivalent in a way, because they're also the ones who are consuming this content in order to build things and create things for other people to use. So I kind of felt like there was some similarity there in terms of almost having this sense of kind of mission around the audience.
Right. Well, one thing that occurs to me as you were talking there about the differences between those environments is that, like you were saying, there's the kind of luxuriously long production cycles and development cycles in the book publishing world, and then you get to the daily world. You're also doing like what 25, 30 books a year, maybe something like that order, and then you go to the Microsoft and you're doing like literally managing probably thousands of pieces of content a month.
Oh, many thousands. Yeah.
Yeah. And so what was your ramp, like, how did you ramp up for that? Like, what were the new skills you had to develop, and how did you cope with that shift in, I mean, it probably helped you a lot, it sounds like, to have that top level, like, yeah, these are all just subject matter experts and content people, and there's a specific discipline I'm kind of focused on, so I've got that to hang on to. But there was a lot of different production and other things going on as well.
Yeah, well, I started off doing pretty similar work at first. So at first, I was just one of a team of editors. So I was very comfortable with the idea of editing content and working with writers. It's sort of over the course of the 10 years, as I started to manage that team of editors and take on, larger responsibilities that, I learned as I went. And so it really wasn't, it wasn't as much of a sort of shock as it might seem. There was definitely sort of a culture shock from going from sort of small press publishing to an engineering-driven, technical company.
Right.
That was probably a bigger shock for me. But again, I was working in a team of editors, so I was kind of working with, my own sort of tribe. So that sort of eased it as well.
Right. And can you talk a little bit, because that was to me one of the starkest things when I made that transition, was the cultural differences between the publishing world and the tech world. And a good content strategist definitely has to bridge those. How can you tell me, are there any great stories or anything from that era about like culture conflicts or ways that the techies found the editorial people and the editorial people found the techies and began to work together?
Well, probably the funniest story is me using, a computer for the first time and trying to, figure out where to put the disk in. But to the amusement of my actual techie office mate. But I don't know. I think everyone understood that there was a need to get this content out there. What we did at MSDN is essentially aggregate content from around the company that's related to developers and publish it all together. And then at a certain point, we started creating content within the group too. So we had writers who were sort of programmer writers who were writing technical articles and creating sample code and so on. But everyone was, kind of all together on this mission of getting this content out and making it useful and usable for people. So I don't know that there were any sort of particularly.
Well, let me rephrase that, or let me ask it a little different way too, because one of the things you're known for, there's a couple things you're known for in the field. I know that the audit and the inventory and the audit content stuff, and I want to talk about that a little bit later. But another thing you're known for is taxonomy, and that's something that I didn't even know that word when I worked in book publishing, but it's a super important concept especially when you're managing millions of pages of content. Right. So tell me, when did taxonomy cross your bow, and like how did you come to cope with that? And how did you apply taxonomy to cope with those challenges of big chunks of information?
Yeah, well, definitely was, my introduction to taxonomy was in MSDN, and it started with, there are a couple of aspects of it. One was, as you said, dealing with millions of pages of content. At that time, the Microsoft library online was literally around a million pages of content. Wow. That's a lot of content to present in some sort of useful way. So there was a need to think about how that was structured and organized so that it could be navigated by the people trying to use it. And then there was also was lucky to be involved in a cross-organizational taxonomy initiative that included people from the Microsoft library and from the various product groups, the technical documentation teams, with the goal of creating a centralized taxonomy and set of vocabularies for tagging content. And it was kind of driven at the time, from the MSDN perspective anyway, of interaction. So MSDN and how it interacted, the MSDN library and how it interacted with the Visual Studio products, required tagging the content. So the idea was that if we had all this content tagged appropriately, then the MSDN content could essentially be presented as help or reference or supportive content within the Visual Studio IDE. So someone's actually in one of the development products, and they can get MSDN content pulled in from the library. So that was an incredible introduction to taxonomy because we were dealing with I said like 1 million pages, and getting first of all the taxonomy worked out along with the other people on this initiative, and then getting it applied was about as trial by fire training as you could get, but it was incredibly valuable. But I remember, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, one of the things, you're at Microsoft, you assume there's some tech talent there, but did you actually have, how much tech talent did you have at your disposal as you're going from that kind of conceptual mapping of all the content and creating the taxonomies to actually implementing it in the CMS or whatever you use to your knowledge base or whatever it was for the MSDN content? How was that stitched together, I guess?
Yeah, well, the tools aspect was definitely part of it because as we were developing this taxonomy, we were also essentially developing the requirements for a taxonomy management tool that was being built specifically for this project. So we did have resources there to build that, and then we also not necessarily 100% about taxonomy, but also within MSDN at the time, we were kind of building our own CMS and migrating those 1 million pages of content into this new CMS as well. So there is something, the resources you have available to you at a company like that are just sort of mind-boggling, that you can just from scratch build the tools you need. Sometimes there's a downside to that in that, every division is building their own tools, and there isn't always as much sort of collaboration as there could be. But I should also say it's been years since I've been at Microsoft, and maybe that's changed.
I gather it's changed a lot in a lot of many ways. Yeah, it's probably a couple of generations have changed since you left.
Yeah.
So, but yeah. So that's it. I want to jump out of Microsoft a little bit because what you just said points to an interesting challenge that I think a lot of content strategists deal with. You were in a place. Obviously, a different time, different kind of mission, but you were in a place that understood technology, really got it. Probably had. Support at many levels and from many directions for this initiative you were doing. But I think a lot of content strategists have to explain, a lot of the things that they took for granted at Microsoft. Do you ever find that you have to explain those or kind of sell things harder for some of your consulting clients?
Well, the good thing about being a consultant versus being in-house is that you're brought in when people understand that they have a problem or a need. So in some ways, you're doing less of that selling. Once you're in there, they may not have, they're looking to you to help define how to solve that problem. So there's still some sales once you're there in terms of kind of convincing them, what's going to need to happen both from a tools perspective to an organizational perspective. But you're not quite starting at that point that I think some of the people who are trying to kick off initiatives as a in-house have to kind of maybe do a lot more of that upfront, getting buy-in and getting sort of the resources they need to do it. So that gives you a little bit of an advantage when you're coming in as a consultant.
I wonder that what you just said, that creates an interesting kind of cultural dynamic when you come in. The in-house implementer, the in-house manager of the project, whatever, who you're coming in to help, you must be like the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow or something dropping into there. So I get that you're usually dropping in because there is a known need and you need to fix it. But you still must have to do a lot of, well, I guess, and this is where I want to kind of transition into talking about your process as a content strategist. So there's clear, they've articulated a need, they get that something needs to be done, they bring you in. Tell me a little bit about your process, like how you discover what needs to be done, how you like and I know that it's not cookie cutter, but do you have sort of a template or a wireframe that you hang your work on?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the first thing that has to happen is a sort of current state analysis. And I would not, I can't think of a project that I've started that didn't start there, which is, you're telling me that you want, this end result, but we've got to back up from that and understand where you are now. What's wrong with what you have now? What can be repurposed from what you have now? So what's the gap between your current state and the desired state? So, you've made an investment in what you have now. You've paid people to create content, you've paid people to maintain it. And it's a business asset. So, whether or not it's working as you want it to right now, it doesn't mean you just sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater and start all over. There's value in understanding that. So it's not only, and I should say, not only understanding what content you have now and kind of how it's working and why it was created and what the intent was, and then we get into sort of analyzing it against whether it's actually fulfilling that intent. But there's also understanding some of the processes and the tools and all of that. So how are you, creating and managing content now? And if that's not going to change, if you're not investing in a new content management system, or you're not investing in developing, better collaboration tools or whatever, then you have to be kind of carrying that into any going forward strategy, because you've got to understand that you're still working with that set of tools and potentially those, that set of people. And so you need to kind of be looking ahead to, if those things aren't changing, what change is reasonable to expect? How much can you sort of get out of what you have?
Right. So that must be a pretty key sort of decision or inflection point in your process. Like, okay, we're not stuck, but they just spent $1 million on this CMS. We're not going to get a new one. We're going to use this system and going forward with that. I guess that gets into another thing that's been not frustrating, but interesting to me in the world of content strategy, is there often seems to be a blurry line between strategy and strategy formulation and the deliverables that come out of that, and the actual implementation of the strategy. Do you have like kind of a handoff at the end of your process, or how do you help people deal with that, getting the difference between the strategy and the implementation?
Yeah, well, ideally, I stay on through implementation. That doesn't always happen. When I'm able to, then I am able to be part of the team that's rebuilding that content, or managing the generation of new content, and if it is a migration or a redesign of some sort, kind of being there to help be the shepherd of that content. But sometimes, and this can be I guess, sort of the good and bad of being a consultant, is that sometimes you come in and you do your work and you leave, and you hand it off, and, hopefully you've given them as much guidance as you can for, how to carry it forward. I often do things like help design workflows and content life cycles, and, mapping, content to, to new design or new templates or whatever. But then when you do have to sort of leave it in their hands, sometimes that goes well and sometimes it doesn't. And that can be, one of the frustrations as a consultant, is not necessarily getting to own that whole process end to end. Sometimes hopefully by the time you get to that point, they're trained and understand what they need to do. Sometimes the implementation doesn't happen. I've had that happen with clients where I've handed off, handed off a strategy, and then for whatever reason, internally the funding gets pulled or whatever. So, but again, best case scenario, I'm able to sort of be there through that process. And second best case scenario is that I'm able to leave behind some tools for implementation.
Hey, speaking of tools, one of the tools, and this kind of goes back earlier in the process, but you, oh shoot, I'm spacing on the name of it. Your content auditing tool.
Content analysis.
Yeah, content analysis. The CAT, content analysis tool. You have a helpful acronym, and I still couldn't remember it. Sorry, early in the morning. But can you tell me about the genesis? Was that one of those things where, as a consultant, you were just like doing it over and over again manually, or using inferior tools, and you were like, "Oh, come on, people, I'm going to do." Where did that come from?
Yeah, well, quite literally, that is it. So, as I said, every project that I do, I start off with a current state analysis, and that starts with something we call a content inventory, which is kind of literally an inventory of the content that's on a website. So, excuse me, before I developed this tool, that was a process that either was a manual process, which is incredibly time consuming, or a process of sort of taking the output of various other tools and kind of munging it together and cleaning it up and getting to something that's useful. And so even, back in my agency days, we would always, ask people in other offices, or there was always kind of a, what do you use to do this? How do you do inventories? Do you guys have any tools there? And they were like, oh, there's really, there's this freeware tool that's a little weird, and you have to install it on your client site, and clients don't necessarily want you installing this. And so anyway, it had been kind of this thing in the back of my head of, this is something that there's a need for. People who do what I do, need this kind of tool. And I think really the impetus is that, using technology to do what technology does best so that humans can do what they do best. Right. And so, the idea of being able to save hours and hours and hours, if not days or weeks of time by, running a tool, it just makes sense, right? And it frees you up, instead of spending half your project hours just getting to that inventory. And then, from there, you're still, then you start your audit, making that inventory process quick and easy then frees you up to spend a whole lot more time doing the stuff that really requires human judgment. So, I think of the analysis step, which is really, so there's sort of an inventory and then an audit, which is, so you're sort of going from a quantitative listing, basically, of everything that's there, excuse me, to a qualitative assessment of that, where you really want to be spending your time is in that qualitative assessment, because that's what's going to lead you to, to the insights and to the patterns and to your strategy, essentially. So it was really all about just kind of speeding things up and taking that one step and making it much more simple and easy.
Interesting. Yeah, I didn't look super close. I signed up and did the free trial and took a quick look. But let me ask you, because I think, well, let me ask you this. How much of your work happens in spreadsheets? That seems to be like spreadsheets and sticky notes seem to be the two main tools in a lot of this. Is that true in your world as well?
It is true. And I think one of the sort of great ironies is that people who are working on content tend to work a lot more, at least in my experience, but anecdotally, I think this is true, work a lot more in spreadsheets than in Word docs, for example, or in other tools. There's just this, it's the right tool in a lot of ways.
I can totally relate. Yeah, I've done a lot of SEO, and and that's like you do like, and so like for me it was like Screaming Frog or some, what's that old, anyhow, there's all these scraper tools that go out and the site and do that, and I assume that yours is something similar. But when I first made the transition from that kind of spreadsheet to more content strategy oriented spreadsheet, it was just adding columns to account for those qualitative things, like sort of some kind of human assessment of the quality of that content, its relevance, that kind of thing. Can you tell me what you look for in that process? Like, what takes it from just an inventory to an audit? Like, what are the factors you're looking at in there?
Yeah, so yes, I do a lot of the auditing in the spreadsheet, although, and I'll talk about this more in a minute if that's okay, kind of what you do sort of post spreadsheet. But yeah, I mean, I start with that sheet of inventory, which is, you've seen it a little bit, but you've got, a list of all the URLs and all the images and all that kind of stuff, the metadata, links in and out, H1s, all that kind of stuff. So you can actually start to do a little bit of analysis even with that data. I mean, you can certainly get a sense of things like the URL patterns and structure. You can look for things like missing or duplicated title tags, for example, which, it's an issue for SEO. You can look at word count on this is, I'm talking about sort of the data that CAT gathers. Right. Look at the word count on the pages and kind of see sort of what your kind of range is there. So there's some things you can kind of start to do right there. But then I would typically, and it really kind of varies from project to project, but I would typically add, depending on, just thinking about like a recent project I did, for example, it was important for that project to understand who the audience for each page was. So they had different personas or different sort of audience segments because the clients wanted to understand how well they were serving each particular audience, or what volume and quality of content they were serving up to each of their audiences. So that was a column I added in, was audience. And so then looking at each page and deciding, is this is this everybody, or the public, or is this media, or is this educators, or whatever it might be. So that's a typical one. You might put in, what, if it's important, again, based on the project, if there's a particular, geography that it's appropriate to. And then some of it is also looking at sort of structural things. And again, if, for example, you were doing a project where you're doing a redesign or a migration, and it's important to know how many pages are in each particular template. You might capture for each page what template it's in, or you might capture, use that spreadsheet to indicate which pages have functionality on them, like forms or whatever else. And then, you could capture, who owns that page or that section of content. So if you need to pull in one of the, the business owners for review, or sign off on any changes or whatever, kind of using that. So the spreadsheet just sort of begins to just accrete all of this additional information that to me, I use an inventory from the first day of a project to the last day of a project, because I also end up using it to track the migration. So I'm adding columns, to indicate whether each page is to be kept or to be removed, or if it needs revision. There's a notes column that will say what revision needs to happen, and then as we as you're sort of moving that stuff into the migration, is this page going to be migrated, yes or no? What template is it going to? What's its new URL going to be? All of that kind of end stage stuff too.
Right. That's it. So at that level, I can see where, like, for you, do you keep sort of the master sheet that has all, because I can see the need for all those columns and all that information you just mentioned. But when you're communicating with other people, I am assuming you kind of pluck different columns or different bits of information to inform the tasks at hand. I'm thinking, for example, of like a taxonomy revision. If you go through and look at how it's structured now, and what pages are working and what aren't, and how people understand things that you might want to revise it, would you just go to like the information architecture team and say, hey, here's some tidying up we need to do. Does that kind of thing arise from that tool?
Yeah, it can. And it, like I said, because it ends up sometimes being essentially what I call an index ultimately is sort of the structure of the news site. So how it's going to be organized, which if content's going to be moved from one section to another, all of that kind of stuff becomes something that then whoever's doing, and because it captures what template it's being migrated to, from and to, this gives development or production teams the information they need to know how to structure it on the other end. So it does just become this kind of single source of information. And yeah, I think pulling out different pieces of it for different audiences happens. And I think one thing I would say is that I would never, as a sort of final deliverable, hand off just a spreadsheet. So, when you're talking about what's the deliverable to the people who are, at the sort of maybe executive level or people who are paying for the project, they need something a little bit more digestible than
exactly. Yeah.
Spreadsheet. So,
do you have a typical sort of list of deliverables that you present at throughout the course of a project? I'm thinking of like the inventory, the audit, you mentioned a gap analysis earlier. What is there sort of a standard list of things that you do?
Yeah, so I think you've kind of mentioned most of them. So an inventory to start with, then continuing to use that spreadsheet to gather all of the information that sort of informs the audit. So the process of auditing is sort of captured in the spreadsheet, but the output, excuse me, of the audit, I usually write up in Word doc form, where I kind of synthesize the information, pull out the major themes. Quite often I'll do things like have screenshots to sort of illustrate what's going on, what some of the issues are. If I've done a competitive audit, where I'm looking at other sites, competitor sites, I'll include that information in this audit doc too.
I just want to quickly observe that isn't an official internet event until there's a cat involved, and that's Paula's cat's tail that you're seeing there.
Yes, I apologize.
No worries at all.
It'll be quieter if she's here than if I put her down.
Yeah.
So there's a written up document that presents and synthesizes all of the analysis. And that usually would also contain the gap analysis, and ultimately present the recommendations. So what's going to happen. And then, again, because putting these documents can end up being pretty large, putting a 50-page document or something in front of somebody is not always the right thing to do. Then I also typically do some sort of presentation to the stakeholders, where I'm pulling it out into a deck, and that's sort of, here are the high points, here are the themes, here are the recommendations, and then that's the point where I'd also do the sort of, here are the next steps, here are the asks in terms of what would be required to do this, here are the risks, that kind of stuff. So that gets in, that's in that presentation.
And that's that point at which sometimes you continue and help with the implementation, and sometimes that's sort of that's the handoff point, it sounds like. Right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Hey, I just noticed I'm amazed at how quickly the time has gone by. Because I'm trying to, I'll just, part of my content strategy in this podcast is to keep it around a half hour. That seems to be, well, both in terms of, I'm just interviewing a bunch of super interesting and important people, and I'm trying to value and honor your time. But also, but anyhow, so I'd love to wrap it up, but I did want to come back. I meant to talk about this at the start, but I just wanted to quickly talk about how we met, because it's likely, given our backgrounds, that we may have run into each other at some publishing event in New York in the 80s or, or the 90s. But anyhow, I was at the Seattle Interactive Conference a few weeks ago, and I was talking to Drory, I forget his last name.
Ben Menachem.
Yeah, Ben Menachem from Smashing Ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked him, I was asking if they had any content strategists at Smashing, and he said, no, not really. And I said, well, do you know any really good people? And he literally grabbed me by the elbow and ran me across the hall where you were sitting, minding your own business. And so I just want to apologize for barging in like that and barging in again now. But thanks so much, Paula. I do want to ask you one last thing before we wrap up. I've heard a couple times recently people, various, kind of coming from different perspectives, talk about content strategy. It's like a buzzword. It's not a thing. It's like a fad that's come and gone. How would you respond to somebody saying something like that?
First of all, no. But I taught a class recently, and one of the things that I tried to help or kind of get across to the people I was teaching is that, if you have ever created content for a purpose with an audience in mind and thought about how you're going to distribute it, you've done content strategy. So that's as time-honored or, as old a tradition as someone sitting at a campfire in a cave telling stories, right? There's nothing new about content strategy. And in fact, when it first kind of started to come into consciousness, sort of the name of it as a discipline, my first thought was, well, this is what we editorial people have been doing forever. We're thinking about audience, and we're thinking about how they like to consume information, and how long or how short, and what tone of voice, and what kind of language do we use, and how do we distribute it? Is it a book? Is it a magazine? Is it a blog post or whatever? There's nothing particularly new about that. I mean, having said that, I love that. I actually love the term content strategy. I think it's just a incredibly descriptive way to think about what we do, and I'm very happy that it's getting that it has become. I mean, even that it's become to the point where people want to say it's a buzzword or something, I guess, is progress, right? So
right. That's kind of when you've made it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I just kind of fundamentally don't agree with that. I think content strategy has been around forever, and it will continue to be around, whatever it's called. It's really this just sort of fundamental thing of understanding, who you're creating for and why, and what your plan is for reaching them.
Well, let me ask you one last question based on that. And I think I can infer it from what you just said, but how would you define content strategy? Like if you had to, somebody at a cocktail party ask you, what does that mean? How do you define it?
Well, what I would probably do is just repeat some of the sort of standard definitions out there, which is, the one you hear the most is it's about getting the right content to the right person at the right time. There are variants on that, but I think, and some of them focus a little bit more on, creating repeatable processes, which is certainly important if you're needing, to scale a strategy. It needs to be definable and repeatable. But I think really at its core, that really is it. It's just about, understanding what is the right content, who needs it, when do they need it, and how do you get it to them.
Great. Well, that's a perfect way to wrap up with a good definition. Well, thank you so much, Paul. I really appreciate you taking the time to be on the show today.
Oh, thank you. It's been fun.
And I'm doing this with everybody. I want to hold out the right to return in like a year or two to see if your thoughts have evolved or what you're up to. So I'm hoping you'll let me barge in again.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Thanks so much, Paula.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening. Tune in next week for another content strategy interview.